several problems we've talked about. The judicial problem has been solved, and now we're going to talk about Congress dealing with repaying the government debt. So, Aaron, what individual is going to be totally responsible for putting a plan together to get this country out of debt? Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, Hamilton had a philosophy, and he knew that a nation, just like an individual, must pay their debts or lose the trust of the people around them. So if I borrow $20 from Joe and I don't pay him back, he's not going to trust to loan me that money. And he's probably going to tell David, and then when I go to David to borrow $10, David's going to say, no, you didn't pay Joe back, so I can't loan you the money. So Alexander Hamilton said there's no question that we have to pay this back. If we lose the trust of our neighbors, we're never going to be able to borrow in the future. Now, does anybody want to guess in those times, this is 1789-90, how much our war debt was? $80 million. Now that is a ton of money in 1780. A lot of money. That's just a staggering sum. Now we had three different types of debt. We had foreign debt, which meant we owed money to who? Foreign countries. We had domestic debt, which means what? We owed money to individuals within the 13 states. And we also had state debts, which means that our states, some of our states were in debt to individuals that lived in that state. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little handout here, save you a little bit of writing, maybe write on this as much as you want, and we'll explain these debts. And we'll start with foreign debt. According to my sheet that I gave you, how much do we owe in foreign debt, Caitlin? $12 million. And Jaden, who do we owe that money to?
France, Spain, and the Netherlands?
That's correct. Now, this was a fairly easy deal because what Hamilton did is he got together and negotiated with representatives from each of those countries, and they agreed that the United States would repay that $12 million with interest over a fixed period of time. Kind of like a car loan. You go buy a car, you borrow $20,000, you pay so much a month over a period of 5 years, and you pay principal and interest. They're making money by lending you this money. And so these countries that lent us money in the amount of $12 million during the Revolutionary War will be repaid with interest over a fixed or a certain period of time. Case closed, we're done there. Domestic debt was $44 million. That was money that the colonies borrowed from individuals. And what these individuals did is they bought government bonds. And we know them now as war bonds. We sold a ton of them in World War II. And basically what happens, if Julie gives me $100, I give her a war bond. And then at the end of the war, she cashes that in for her 100 plus some for lending my country that money. So we had $44 million of debt that the Continental Congress had borrowed from individual Americans by selling them war bonds. And each bond was a promise that the loan would be paid back in time with interest. Well, I want you to think about a little controversy that this caused, because things weren't going so great during a lot of the Revolutionary War. And the only way these people got paid back and interest is if what? If we won the war. So, as people got more nervous as the war went not in our favor, what did they do with their government bonds, Kyra? Well, you can't bow out, but what might you do? I guess you could bow out, but you got this piece of paper, it says it's worth $100 plus interest at the end of the war, but you're getting nervous we won't win the war, so what might you do? What? What did you say? Oh, no, but what do you think?
Burn it.
Well, you don't want to burn it because you'll lose everything you got into it.
Cash it.
You can't cash it till the end of the war. Sell it. So you find people that want to take a risk and buy it. Very good, my dear. What are those people called? We talked about them before. they did it with land the first time. Speculators. So what these people did is they kind of took advantage of this and said, oh, Peyton, a little nervous? Hey, I think we're going to get our butts kicked. I'll tell you what, give me that $100 bond and I'll give you 50 for it. Oh, I want to give you, I'll sell it because I'd rather have 50 than nothing. I'd rather lose only 50. Well, this happened a lot. And so, because the government's finances were in trouble, the war was going poorly, many of these bondholders sold their bonds for a fraction of what they were worth because they thought we'll at least get some of our money back. Well, these speculators had all these bonds. And Congress said to Alexander Hamilton, the hell with those people. We're not going to pay them anything for these government bonds because they're not the ones that purchased them. We're not going to let them take advantage of the situation. Although I think Alexander Hamilton understood what they were saying, he did not agree. He said, we have got to pay these bonds off at their original value no matter who holds them. Or our dignity and credit is no good. Nobody will loan us money if we put provisions on paying back. So even though Congress didn't want to do that, Hamilton convinced Congress that if the nation's credit was going to be established, they had to pay these debts. And the same case as the foreign debt, these people that held these government bonds, no matter who they were paid the original amount that they lent plus interest over a period of years. So we financed it, so to speak, the same way, but the controversy was whether or not we were going to pay them. And like I said, Congress didn't feel like we should because these people didn't originally buy them, and Hamilton said we had to. Now, state debts, which are how much, Navy, according to the sheet, how much we owe on state debts? I didn't put it on there. $24 million. Now, I want you to understand this, because this is important to understand. This was not a debt that the overall government owed. It was a debt that individual states owed to individuals that lent them money, for example, maybe to keep their militia going in North Carolina. So North Carolina state officials borrowed money from people in that state to keep their state going. Okay? Now, this is what the controversy was. Most, if not all, of the southern states had already paid back their citizens that they owed. But some of the northern states, matter of fact, most of the northern states, still owed their citizens money. And a lot of people were upset in the South saying, wait a minute, I'm not going to be taxed to pay back that $24 million because our state paid our people back. We're not doing that. And Hamilton said, no, we've got to get this debt taken care of. And so you're going to have to pay your share. Your tax money is going to go to pay off the state debt in Massachusetts, even though in South Carolina you paid theirs. Well, that didn't go over very well. Would it go over very well with you if you had to chip in to pay somebody else's debt? Well, again, Alexander Hamilton wanted the federal government to assume all of this $24 million that was owed by select individual states to pay back their own citizens, and this led to a controversy. The southern states who had paid off their debt argued it was unfair to force them to assume their neighbors' burdens, especially those in the north. And so the only way that got settled is they had to come up with a compromise. And the compromise turned out to be what we know in American history as the Assumption Bill. So this compromise on this state owing individuals in those states money that would be assumed by all 13 colonies, now states, who had already paid their bills, led to a compromise known as the Assumption Bill. So, the Southerners who had paid their state debts were led by Thomas Jefferson. And they agreed, finally, that the national government would assume all of those state debts. So they're going to be kind of paying double. Does that make sense? So they agreed to that. The Southerners, under the leadership of Thomas Jefferson, agreed that the national government would assume the state debts. Well, do you think they're just doing that for nothing? They're going to want something in return. And that's what this Assumption Bill turns out to be. because the Southerners, led by Thomas Jefferson, agreed that the national government would assume the state debts, the Northerners, led by Alexander Hamilton, agreed that they would move the nation's capital from New York City to Philadelphia. And that capital would remain in Philadelphia for a minimum of 10 years. So the Assumption Bill was a compromise between North and South that stated that if the South agreed to assume these state debts, even though they had already paid off their state debts, in return the North would agree to move the capital from New York City, which was considered in the North, more southward to Philadelphia, and it would stay there for 10 years. That was the Assumption Bill, and that's what solved that financial problem. Okay? Now, just a little side note. After that 10-year period was over, which was 1800, it was decided that the national capital would be moved to the banks of the Potomac River on land that was donated by Virginia and Maryland. And so after that 10-year time period was over, the capital was moved from Philadelphia to the banks of the Potomac River on land donated by Virginia and Maryland, and it became our new nation's capital and was named Washington, D.C., District of Columbia. So that is the story behind the capital being where it is today. It's after the Assumption Bill and after the 10-year period in which Philadelphia was our capital, the capital was then moved to the banks of the Potomac River on land donated by Virginia and Maryland, and it became Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, as you see it today. Okay? All right. Now we have to solve the problem of where to put tax money when we decide to collect it. And that will be our next subtopic, which is Alexander Hamilton's bank proposal. Alexander Hamilton's bank proposal. So we've settled the issue of debt, right? We're going to pay back all of our debt basically over a period of time with interest, right? That's what we decided to do. So we've got a plan there. Well, now we got to get a way to raise taxes, but before we raise tax money, we got to find a place to put it. So this brings us to Alexander Hamilton's bank proposal. So after the issue of finances was solved, Hamilton asked Congress to pass a law that created a national bank, which would be called the Bank of the United States. Now this would not be just one bank, it would be one large central bank with branch banks in major American cities. Okay? So the Bank of the United States would not be just one big bank, it would be one larger bank with branch banks in major American cities. Now, Hamilton pointed out to Congress these three advantages of having a national bank. This is what he saw as advantages of having a national bank. Well, the first one's pretty obvious. Each of these branches would provide safe places for tax officials to put this tax money they had accumulated. So there's the first advantage of a national bank, is it gave a place to put tax money that is collected. A second advantage is when they transferred money from one branch bank to another, they would not use gold and silver because it would be risky. They would transfer the money by sending checks, which was new to the American states. Checks wasn't something they were used to. So checks, as you know them in a checking account, kind of come from this. So he points out, hey, number two, if we want to transfer money from one branch bank to another, we won't have to take the risk of traveling with gold and silver. We'll just transfer the money by using checks. And the third advantage probably made a lot of sense. What were people's feelings on paper money right now? They don't like them, did they? No, they wanted gold and silver. Well, that just wasn't practical anymore. And then there were all kinds of different currency going around. I mean, there was still British money in the colonies. And so the benefit of a national bank was that you could create a sound, uniform currency in which if I pulled a bill out of my pocket, this $20 bill would be worth $20 in Caitlin's state and in Erin's state. Everybody had the same money. We wouldn't be dealing with British pounds or those types of things. So it gave the United States a uniform currency that would have the same value all over the United States. And what it did is it restored the citizens' faith in what? Paper money. So paper money comes onto the scene here after the Bank of the United States is formed. So the three advantages: it puts a safe place for tax officials to deposit money they collected from the people. Number two, it gave them the ability to transfer money by using check rather than gold and silver. And three, it created a sound, uniform currency in which Americans would have more confidence in paper money. Now, I've got your ID sheet just a little bit out of order. The next subtopic is the election of 1792. 1792. 1792. I'm not sure how that got down there. Now, remember the rule. The electors are going to elect the president and the vice president based on what? Top vote getter, president. Second vote getter, vice president. So nobody's really running for vice president. They're all running for president. Here are your candidates in the election of 1792. George Washington is going to run for re-election. John Adams is going to run for the presidency, who's now serving as vice president. A fellow by the name of George Clinton is going to run for the presidency. Thomas Jefferson throws his name in the ring. And finally, a fellow by the name of Aaron Burr, who we'll talk about later, threw his hat in the ring. So there were 5 candidates in the election of 1792 trying to be president: George Washington, John Adams, George Clinton, Thomas Jefferson, and Aaron Burr. Keep in mind, the top vote getter will be president, the second vote getter will be vice president. Is it possible that George Washington could end up as the vice president? After, yeah. Well, here are the tallies. In last place, Aaron Burr with 1 vote. In 4th place with 4 votes. Guess? You'd think George Clinton, but actually it was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was in 4th place with 4. In 3rd place, just out of the running for any office, was George Clinton. He had 50 votes. 50. John Adams is the runner-up with 77. And George Washington is re-elected president with 132 electoral votes. So, as a result, George Washington will be re-elected, and John Adams will be re-elected to the same positions they had served before. Okay? That'll take us to the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion. Yeah. Yep. Now, we've solved the problem of paying back our debt. We've solved the problem of establishing a bank to put our money in. Now we got to tax some people to get some money in there. So shortly after Washington was re-elected to this second term, Congress passed 2 pieces of legislation to collect taxes to put in the federal treasury. So shortly after Washington was re-elected president, Congress passed 2 pieces of legislation to collect taxes for the federal treasury. The first tax was a foreign tax, which means we were taxing who, Lily? Foreigners, very good. And basically the tax is going to be placed on any foreign country that comes into our port and sells goods to our people. So anybody from France or Great Britain or the Netherlands or Spain that traveled to America to trade with us would have to pay a tax on what they were bringing in. Okay? That was an easy one. How much did that cost American colonists? Nothing. Okay? The second tax would be a domestic tax, which means it's going to affect the people that live within the country. And this particular tax would be a tax on distilled liquor or whiskey. They put a tax on distilled liquor or whiskey. So if you produced or sold distilled liquor or whiskey, you would pay a tax on every gallon that you produced or sold. Okay? They tax alcohol now. I don't know if you know that or not. If you buy alcohol when you get old enough to do so, you're going to pay so much for a 6-pack of beer. Well, part of that's going to be taxed. They're taxing, just so you know. Now, when Congress passed this liquor tax into law, it caused a lot of controversy with farmers on the American frontier. Because these farmers out here on the American frontier were having difficulty growing all kinds of crops and getting them transported to the east to sell them. It was a big burden. It was hard to do. So they decided they would just only raise one crop, corn. And they would grow corn and make distilled liquor or whiskey, because transporting barrels of whiskey on mules was much easier than trying to transport crops and those types of things to the east. So what these frontier farmers did is they got tired of the difficult transfer, so they started growing corn exclusively and were making that into distilled liquor, because it was easy to load barrels of whiskey on mules and drive them eastward than it was all these other crops, etc. So, what's the major income for the farmers in the frontier? Whiskey. Do you think they're interested in parting with some of their profits by paying this tax? No, they're not very happy about it. And what they're going to do